Okay, Evgeny, does the internet bring us freedom and democracy as often claimed?
Well, I think the answer is very easy, and it's yes, it does bring us those things, but it brings us many others as a bonus. And it's that bonus that I've been investigating, and very often you see that in addition to enabling us to do many more things quickly and efficiently and collectively, organizing protests and so forth, all of the traditional benefits of the social media and digitization, I also hear that it enables, you also see that it enables new forms of surveillance, new ways of propaganda, new ways of control, new ways of censorship, new ways of domination. All of that is happening as well, and our lives are becoming more and more digitized. They are also becoming more and more dominated by the logic of the market, I would argue, as much of our data now is being seen as an asset, and much of what we do now is thought purely in financial terms and predictive terms. That in itself is a very negative trend, but so I think we have to maintain an agnostic attitude. So we should not take a position on whether it's good or bad as such. We should try to mitigate the negatives, and we should try to amplify the positives.
You say big data builds a foundation for preemptive government. What is preemptive government, and what are possible problems?
Sure. So when I talk about preemptive governance, I primarily think of ways in which real-time analysis of data allows you to dissolve problems rather than solve them. So instead of waiting until something becomes a crisis that requires attention, we actually rely on the ability to analyze and predict data to identify its symptoms early on and to try to mitigate those symptoms. Right? So instead of actually doing something about the causes of the crisis, as we have done traditionally under the previous models of governance, where we try to investigate why is there such a thing as climate change, why is there such a thing as bad health, why is there such thing as misbehavior in financial markets, we instead move to a very different mode where we are trying to figure out, well, what it is that we can regulate in order to mitigate the consequences of the climate change. What is it that we can do to mitigate the consequences of financial markets that are completely running on their own logic? What are the things we can do early on to prevent all of those problems or of preventing the effects we do not like? So essentially, preemptive governance is all about governing the effects rather than governing causes.
Is preemptive government something that originated with the internet, or can you trace it back earlier?
No, you can probably trace it back earlier with to the various transformations of the modern state, the way in which policing, for example, and the rise of things like situational crime prevention in the United States, for example, happened before the internet. And it's the idea that you can tinker with the built environment in order to reduce the amount of crime, right? So you can actually make crime impossible rather than wait until it happens and then prosecute the perpetrator, right? So you can design certain features of our, subway system or city system in such a way that people cannot violate the rule, right? And that way you don't actually have to think about what happens to the criminals. You just make criminals impossible. What happened with the internet and digital technology is that they have made preemptive governance much easier and much cheaper, because now that everything is programmable, you can program things to a point where dissent is eliminated from the system entirely, right? And this is what worries me so much, that this essentially it's an alliance between an older political ideology and this new technological environment that we see happening.
Does the technological development have a momentum in itself, and do we have to do everything that's possible?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are clearly certain developments that are happening because technology can only operate in a certain manner. I mean, you will not be able to take, the engine from an airplane and make it work with a car, right? So, I mean, there are certain restrictions on what is possible that derive solely from the features of the technological and engineered environment. However, I would argue that many of the changes we've seen in the last decade or so are driven primarily by what these technologies enable to do for some political and economic projects. So the reason why data mining, to give one example, has become so powerful in the last decade, or I would say in the last 15 years, 14 years, is because it has proven to be tremendously useful in the fight against terror. So the ability to identify terrorism in real time and sort them out based on how much risk they pose to society is something that in itself is the product of our fear that has to do with our foreign policy, 9/11 and so forth. So many of the technological developments, the same can be said, for example, our facial recognition technology, again, is there to spot potential terrorists in airports. Much of those developments do come out of politics, economics, history, and so forth. And it's by uncovering those drivers of history that we'd be able to make sense of technology. We wouldn't be able to make sense of it just by analyzing its internal components.
How is it possible to strengthen democracy and participation of the people in this process, or maybe against this process?
Well, it's the most complicated question facing us today, and it's the same question you have to ask about how is it possible to bring democracy and participation in all of this big policy and economic institutions that I've talked about previously. I mean, how do you make sure that the voices of the citizens are still heard when it comes to fighting terror or regulating Wall Street or fighting the lobbyists? And I'm afraid that citizens are not very much heard of. That's why you see so much discontent and the growth of alternative political movements, as you have evidence in Europe and the European elections, for example. People are just discontent with the current political process, and I think for good reasons. So I wish I could give you an easy answer and just say we can set up deliberative panels where everybody will show up and offer their voice. I just don't think that those panels have anything to do with how policy is actually made. Policy at this point is made by lobbyists sitting in rooms with the regulators and companies sending those lobbyists and paying for elections to regulators and so forth. And citizens have their control over it on both of issues of technology and outside. So I have a very bleak picture for how we ought to solve these things. I think that the best we can do is to hope that we'll be able to come up and end up with some kind of infrastructure that is not solely controlled by either the state or the companies, and then citizen movements will be able to use it to push for change. I mean, I see it as almost direct action. I don't see a reasonable kind of, Habermasian public sphere, we should all get together and talk about what we should change in how Silicon Valley runs approach as being very effective. Silicon Valley doesn't give a damn.
Okay. One last special question. We are here at the Congress of the Metal Workers Union. What do you think the digitalization will do to more or less skilled jobs?
Well, it depends on how more or less skilled they are. I mean, for the less skilled jobs, I think we know what the answer is, and the answer is that they'll go away. The more skilled ones, I think, will move increasingly towards more cognitive tasks and more cognitive analysis, where the job of the workers would be to generate buzz and virality and excitement and ideology and culture around products, right? And to make things that appeal to the psyche that is still very hard for computers to capture. So we'll all be idea entrepreneurs, and those who aren't idea entrepreneurs, I'm afraid, will be unemployed. That's why the only solution that will help us resolve some of these issues will be some kind of basic income that will be provided to all citizens and that they will then be able to use as they wish. So, I mean, it's not in itself such a bad thing that machines are taking over, as long as some of the gains achieved with those machines are passed on to the workers and not just captured by a bunch of billionaires in Silicon Valley.